Hi everyone, welcome back to Steve's View. When the United States launched its military operation against Iran, many people expected a quick and decisive outcome. The logic seemed straightforward. Remove the leadership, destroy key military capabilities, apply overwhelming pressure, force the government in Tehran to change course. For supporters of the operation, this was supposed to be a demonstration of American power, a message that hostile regimes could no longer challenge the United States without consequences. But several months later, one question has become increasingly difficult to ignore. Did America underestimate Iran? Because history has repeatedly shown that defeating a government is not the same thing as transforming a country, and removing a leader is not the same thing as replacing a political system. This is the dilemma now facing the Trump administration. The United States may have achieved important military objectives, but the much harder question remains. What happens next? The starting point of this conflict was the belief that Iran's leadership structure was vulnerable. For years, Iran has been under economic pressure. The country has faced sanctions, diplomatic isolation, internal political disagreements, and economic problems. Many observers believed that if enough pressure was applied, the government in Tehran could eventually weaken from within. This thinking was based on a familiar pattern in international politics. When authoritarian governments lose their leadership, their systems sometimes collapse. The fall of governments in places like the Soviet Union and some Eastern European countries created the idea that removing the top leadership could produce rapid political change. And in some cases, that strategy has worked. But Iran presents a very different challenge. Iran is not simply a country controlled by one individual. It is a complex political system that has spent decades building institutions designed to survive pressure from foreign powers. The Islamic Republic has multiple layers of power: the supreme leader, the Revolutionary Guard, religious institutions, security organizations, political networks, economic interests. Even if one powerful figure disappears, the system itself may continue. And that is the key difference between Iran and some other countries where American intervention produced rapid leadership change. This is where the comparison with Venezuela becomes important. Some analysts have compared Iran to Venezuela because both countries have faced economic problems, international sanctions, political opposition, government legitimacy challenges. But the comparison has serious limits. Venezuela, under Nicolás Maduro, has largely depended on a centralized political structure built around one ruling circle. Iran is different. The Iranian state has survived a revolution, a devastating war with Iraq, decades of sanctions, multiple waves of domestic protests. Its political system was specifically created with survival in mind. That does not mean Iran is invulnerable. No government is. But it does mean that changing Iran is far more complicated than simply removing a few individuals at the top. And this leads to a larger historical lesson. America has learned this lesson many times. Military victory is often the easiest part. Political reconstruction is the hardest. In Iraq, the United States removed Saddam Hussein's government in a matter of weeks. But rebuilding Iraq's political system took years and came with enormous costs. The collapse of Libya's government after Muammar Gaddafi was removed created another example. The removal of a dictator did not automatically create stability. Instead, competing groups fought for power, and the country experienced years of chaos. Afghanistan presented perhaps the clearest example. The United States spent 2 decades fighting the Taliban and building a new Afghan government. But when American forces withdrew, the Taliban returned to power. The lesson from these cases is not that military action never works. Sometimes military force is necessary. The lesson is more complicated. Destroying a government and creating a stable replacement government are two completely different missions. This is why Iran represents such a difficult challenge. The question is not only, can America damage Iran's military? The answer is probably yes. The United States has enormous military advantages. The question is, can America create the political outcome it wants afterward? That is much harder. Because nations are not machines. They are societies with history, identity, institutions, and millions of people with their own interests. Foreign governments can influence political change, but they rarely control the final result. Another important question is whether Iran's internal opposition can replace the current system. Supporters of regime change often argue that many Iranians are unhappy with their government. That is certainly true. There have been repeated protests over economic conditions, political restrictions, women's rights, government corruption. Many Iranians have expressed frustration with the current leadership, but dissatisfaction with a government does not automatically create agreement about what comes next. This is one of the most difficult problems in international politics. Opposition movements often unite around what they oppose, but they may disagree deeply about what they support. A successful transition requires more than removing the old leadership. It requires a functioning alternative, a political structure, public legitimacy, security institutions, economic stability. Without those things, a country can enter a dangerous period of uncertainty. For President Trump, this creates a strategic dilemma. Trump has always criticized America's previous wars in the Middle East. He argued that the United States spent too much money and lost too many lives in conflicts that did not produce lasting results. His political message has often been, America should avoid endless wars. America should use strength, but avoid nation building. But Iran creates a difficult contradiction. If the United States successfully weakens Iran, but then walks away, critics may argue that America failed to achieve a lasting political outcome. But if the United States stays deeply involved in rebuilding Iran's political system, critics may argue that Trump created exactly the kind of long-term commitment he previously opposed. This is the trap that many American presidents have faced. The first decision, whether to use force, is often easier than the second decision, how do you leave? There is also a domestic political dimension. Foreign policy does not happen in isolation from American politics. A prolonged conflict with Iran could affect energy prices, inflation, consumer confidence, the 2026 midterm elections. For ordinary Americans, the most immediate question may not be about Iranian politics. It may be, how much does gasoline cost? Is inflation rising again? Is America becoming involved in another expensive overseas conflict? Historically, presidents often face political pressure when foreign conflicts create economic problems at home. A war that begins with strong public support can become politically difficult if the costs continue rising. But supporters of Trump's approach would make a different argument. They would say, America spent decades trying diplomacy and containment with Iran. Those strategies failed to stop Iran's nuclear ambitions and regional influence. From this perspective, military pressure was necessary because previous approaches only allowed Iran to become stronger. They argue that showing overwhelming force could create a new reality in the Middle East. In their view, the biggest mistake would not be acting too strongly. It would be allowing America's enemies to believe Washington lacks the will to respond. This is the fundamental debate. One side argues, America must demonstrate strength. If hostile governments believe the United States will never use force, they will continue challenging American interests. The other side argues, strength without a realistic political strategy can create new problems. Military power can destroy threats, but it cannot automatically build a stable future. Both sides are responding to real historical experiences. America has sometimes succeeded through decisive action, but America has also experienced the consequences of entering conflicts without a clear exit strategy. So the biggest question surrounding the Iran war is not simply whether the United States can win battles. It is whether the United States can achieve its political goals. Because wars are ultimately judged not by the first weeks of fighting, they are judged by what happens years later. Did the conflict create greater security? Did it reduce threats? Did it produce a more stable region? Or did it create another cycle of instability? Those are the questions that history will eventually ask. The Iran conflict also reveals a broader challenge for American foreign policy. The United States remains the world's most powerful military and economic power, but power does not eliminate complexity. Modern conflicts are rarely decided only by aircraft, missiles, or military technology. They are decided by politics, culture, institutions, and the ability to understand another society. That may be the most important lesson from America's experiences in the Middle East over the past several decades. A country can defeat an army. It can remove a leader. It can destroy military facilities. But changing a nation is a much harder task. Whether you support or oppose Trump's strategy toward Iran, one question remains. Did the United States fully understand what comes after victory? Because history shows that the moment after a military success can be more important than the victory itself. The United States has faced this question many times before. In Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Libya, and now, potentially, in Iran. The world will be watching whether this becomes a case of American strength successfully reshaping the Middle East, or another example of how difficult it is for any great power to transform another country from the outside. Thanks for watching.